because I forget to record these things sometimes. And, having a stable of Talmud videos in our YouTube channel so that nobody can watch them is really great. Some people watch them. Jeremy recorded all of them. Jeremy was a stickler, Rabbi Marquise. May his memory of him now being in Washington, D.C. continue to be a blessing for all of us. Jeremy recorded everything. It takes 15 minutes to post something to the internet. And for 2 viewers, I don't know that that's worth it, but we're going to record it anyways for posterity. It's good to see you all this morning. Noreen is on a bus.
If you're the one viewer who couldn't come to class, it's worth gold.
That's true. But if during that 15 minutes I could have written the great op-ed that would be seen by 15 million people in the New York Times, then chaval al-zman, as you say in Hebrew. There's only so many hours in the day. All right.
You wrote a wonderful piece in the Chronicle.
Thank you. I can't help but wonder if you're not saying that as the mother of the woman whose op-ed I was supporting. But that's okay.
I don't necessarily agree with either you or Amy.
Yeah, right. But nobody comes after my Amy. Anybody who messes with my Amy is getting horns and teeth, claws. All right.
What I'd love to discuss, but we're not going to, which is probably just as well, with the Israelis is what's going on in the Ukraine and how Israel reacts.
Not here and now, though. You're not. You can.
That's not related to Miami, Florida, that we used to joke about with the kids.
Right. I am happy to leave. By the way, I'm happy to leave the Zoom on at 10:15 so that we can keep doing it. But people pay the good money. People pay the good money for this Talmud class so that they can.
Oh, I know.
So as Austin Powers would say, behave, Rav Judy. Olivia asked what the connection is between the op-eds. Both of them are Rabbi Amy Bardak wrote an op-ed for the Jewish Chronicle 3 weeks ago. Actually, she wrote it for E-Jewish Philanthropy, and the Chronicle picked it up, which they didn't really ask her to. And the op-ed was people with, I'll say it non-controversially, people with a wide variety of views on Israel and Zionism should be welcomed as both professionals and spiritual, participants in Jewish institutions in North America. And I basically said the same thing. I just said it from a different way, which was I used Maimonides, who wrote 13 Principles of Faith, and then everybody roundly told him he was wrong and there are no principles of faith in Judaism, that we don't have ideologies or dogmas that define who gets to participate in Jewish life and who gets to work in a Jewish institution or not. That's it. That's the two things that I said. I don't believe in cutting people off from Jewish life because with a few limitations, right? Like I think the argument that a couple of my colleagues immediately threw at me was, what about Jews for Jesus? And the answer is, they're not Jews, so they don't count. So, but anyways, we're getting down a rabbit hole. Let's do Talmud, which is not controversial at all. I'll share a screen with you. We're going to pick it up somewhere around where we left off. We're on page 30 in our page of Talmud. And where we are on page 30 is we've just gone through an argument. We're on 30A. My little notes are, my little flags are all in the wrong place, which is really, my flags are in the wrong place. It's really throwing me off, but the page that you're looking at in front of you is correct. Also, I had an emergency phone call from a fellow rabbi during my prep time and didn't get to prep at all. So Mark, you're in charge today. Mark Elliott, no, we'll do the best we can. So reminding ourselves that last week in the Talmud, what we were talking about was effectively the question of whether the obligation to convene a Beit Din in order to blow shofar on Shabbat was merely perfunctory, right? There needed to be a Beit Din in the city in which shofar was blown, but everyone can blow shofar on Shabbat as long as during the time at which a Beit Din is convened, or whether it has like de jure meaning that like the only place you can blow shofar is in front of a Beit Din, because the Beit Din is the people who decide whether the blowing of shofar on Shabbat is being done correctly. And by that, we generally understand it to mean that they supervise that the shofar that is blown was not carried, right? That basically they know that the shofar that sat on the shulchan at the Beit Knesset that the Beit Din is meeting at was on the shulchan the night before, and Chaim Yankel didn't carry it from Rechavia, and violate the tchum of Shabbat. Didn't pass through the boundary by which an item cannot be carried. The tchum of Shabbat is generally, even if you have an eruv, is like 1,000, is like 1 mil or 1,000 meters roughly from wherever you are. So no matter how far you carry something, if your eruv is really big in a city, there is actually technically, I believe, a maximum walking distance, right? Like even if the entire island of Manhattan is encased in an eruv, you may not walk from Washington Heights. You may walk, but you definitely may not carry from Washington Heights to Battery Park, right? I use Manhattan because I actually do believe that Manhattan has a giant eruv. Don't quote me on that halachic ruling, though. The distance with which one walks on Shabbat is not my area of expertise. Parenthesis, I drive on Shabbat, and therefore I most certainly violate the laws of Shabbat as according to the Shulchan Aruch and the Talmud. I follow the rules that the law committee laid down, which is basically that you can drive on Shabbat. So yeah, to synagogue and back, not to the mall, blah, blah, blah. Okay, here we go. So that's a kind of a summary of where we left off. We're going to pick up with the next item. I think this is roughly where we left off. And if it's not, forgive us. Mark, you're going to read the English since I picked on you to be the head of the class anyway. Ika dematne leha de Rav Huna aha dichtiv bayom kippurim ta'viru shofar b'kol artzechem melamed shekol yachid ve'yachid chayav litkoa amar Rav Huna ve'im Beit Din my im Beit Din bizman Beit Din la'afuke shala bizman Beit Din dela.
Some teach the statement of Rav Huna not with regard to this Mishnah, but rather with regard to this Braita that deals with the Jubilee year, as it is written, on Yom Kippur you shall proclaim with the shofar throughout all your land, Leviticus 25:9. This teaches that each and every individual is obligated to sound the shofar. In this connection, Rav Huna said, and they sound it with the court. The Gemara asks, what is the meaning of the phrase with the court? The Gemara explains, when the court is in session. This serves to exclude a case when the court is not in session, that the shofar is not sounded.
Right. So pretty standard. I just wanted to, we kind of ripped through this last week, but we have a very, and I think the only thing that's notable here of things I didn't say, and if anyone has any comment, please jump in. But the thing that's notable here is it's a standard Talmudic logic, which is, as I like to say, ibayde masavar, ibayde makra. You have two main linchpins in Talmudic argumentation by which you may argue something. Ibayde masavar, you may come with a logical inference, right? It makes sense. It stands to reason. It makes sense that, da 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 da. Or ibayde makra, you bring it by a verse from Torah, right? So here they have a verse from Torah, on Yom Kippur you shall proclaim with the shofar throughout the land, with regard to the Jubilee year, which teaches that every individual is obligated to sound the shofar, which implies potentially that the blowing of shofar is an individual right and not a collective right. And then Rav Huda immediately jumps in and asks, what does that mean, right? Does that mean at the time the court means, or does it mean that it is before the court? And he's using it, Rav Huna is kind of sideways making this inference with a verse that specifically regards Jubilee year, right? To say, it probably means during the time, but it's not a slam dunk. I started to say last week it was a slam dunk. It's not. It's not a slam dunk because this piece of text is referring to Jubilee year, and we were blowing shofar for Jubilee year. We are not dealing with the case of blowing shofar for Jubilee year. We are dealing with the case of blowing the shofar instead for Rosh Hashanah, right? To proclaim Rosh Hashanah. All right, onward. And Elisheva, I'm going to have you read the English. Meitiv Rava, Tkiyad Rosh Hashanah v'yovel docha et haShabbat bigvulin, ish uveto. My ish uveto. This is where we left off last week without getting into it. Ilema ish ve'ishto. Itata mi mechayva. Vaha mitzvat ase shazman grama hi. V'kol mitzvat ase shazman grama nashim piturot.
Rava raised an objection from a baraita. The sounding of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah and on Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year overrides the prohibition of Shabbat, even in the outlying areas outside the temple, every man and his house. The Gemara asks, what is the meaning of the phrase, every man and his house? If we say that it means, as usual, every man and his wife, is a woman obligated to sound the shofar? Is it sounding the shofar a positive time-bound mitzvah, that is, one that can be performed only at a certain time of day, or during the day rather than during the night, or only on certain days of the year? And the principle is that with regard to any positive time-bound mitzvah, women are exempt.
So we mentioned this last week of talking about who is obligated in the hearing of shofar and who is not, who is obligated in the blowing of shofar and who is not. They are opening up an old thing, and they are using a baraita, which specifically uses the language ishu veto, right? A man and his house, which, as I mentioned last week, in Yoma, we learn, in the Mishnah of Yoma, we learned that Ishu beito, zo ishto, right? A house is referred to as a man's wife, okay? So pardoning the incredibly gendered language of the Talmud here and the incredibly heteronormative language of the Talmud here, we're trying to suss out who's obligated in shofar. Now, the thing that's interesting that I just looked up as we were going back is, what did we learn a few pages ago? Because I started to speak authoritatively, that what we learned in the Talmud regarding the obligation of women goes back to a few pages ago. That is not exactly true, because I'm going to read to us the Mishnah, which we read about a month ago on Kaf Tet Amud Aleph, page 29a, which if you want to go back in your Sefaria, you can do. The end of that Mishnah says, Chera shote v'katan ein motzin et harabim yedei chovatan. A deaf mute, a mentally deficient individual, and a minor may not discharge the obligation of the majority from their obligation. Meaning, an 11-year-old child cannot blow shofar. A deaf mute cannot blow shofar, and one without mental faculties cannot blow shofar. I see you, Elisheva. Hang on one sec. They go on in the Gemara to argue about what exactly it is qualitatively about these individuals that precludes them from being able to blow shofar. And in that discussion, they mention women, but not from a Mishnah, right? They kind of go by the by. So now we have a baraita that implies that the sounding of shofar is incumbent upon every man and his house. And so suddenly the rabbis are like, and his house, did we suddenly obligate women in hearing, and then parenthetically of blowing of shofar? And the answer becomes, or the immediate answer is, that can't be so, because shofar is absolutely a positive time-bound commandment, a mitzvat aseh shazman grama. That's the kind of phrase we were forced to memorize in rabbinical school for exams. And you should all memorize it for next week's class. It'll be on the test. But mitzvat aseh, positive commandment, shehazman grama, so that is time-bound. or that time impinges upon or is causative towards, gorem. So now we have like this other principle in Jewish law that interferes with our understanding of what we just read at the top of this page. So we have a classic Talmudic disagreement, right? We have a line that implies women are obligated in hearing shofar. And then at the bottom, we have a separate law that implies that, logically speaking, women cannot be obligated in hearing shofar, okay? By the way, all of this is really interesting, but academic for us as conservative Jews. I'm going to speak authoritatively as if this was a conservative-only class, in that the law committee both in their 1985 ruling by Joel Roth, and again in a later ruling that I think was dropped in like 2002, stated that Joel Roth believed that women needed to sign a statement in order to go to rabbinical school, affirming that they would take on positive time-bound commandments, because he believed that you couldn't blanket force all women in conservative Judaism to become observant of positive time-bound commandments. The problem with that was women, and this is about equality, women who went to rabbinical school in the 80s and 90s in America were treated differently than men, right? Which you may not like, but there wasn't a great way around it. It meant that when I went to rabbinical school, and this didn't happen at Ziegler, the rabbis just didn't require this. But when you went to JTS as a woman, you had to sign a document in front of Joel Roth that said, I'm going to do a thing. Me, Rabbi Goodman, I was born a male and identify as a man, and therefore it didn't apply to me, right? I was stuck to some degree. I was stuck with it. But I couldn't show up in rabbinical school and say, I don't want to be bound by positive time-bound commandments. In fact, effectively, and this is a thing that I told you all last week, sometimes I absolve myself of the responsibility, right? School drop-off time is during morning minyan, and therefore I absolve myself of going to morning minyan. Now, if I wanted to, I could say, I should go to the 6:30 minyan at one of the local Orthodox synagogues and get back in time to, pour my kids Cheerios. But that's not realistic, one. And two, I don't believe in davening in a non-egalitarian setting. So it's really complicated, right? Like it's really, and that's Judaism. The last thing I was going to say before I call on you, Elisheva, is we don't do that anymore. The law committee changed the law, effectively changed the law, I think in 2002, with a tshuva written by a woman rabbi, and the statement that the women, I think it was two women rabbis, was we take it as a point of fact, effectively, that women in the modern era are equal to men. And therefore, all women in the conservative movement that choose to are obligated in positive time-bound meets. So it's a weird, difficult nether region kind of thing on some level, which is you wake up as a woman and you say, I want to be obligated in positive time-bound commandments, and therefore you are. Case closed, right? You don't have to sign a document before Joel Roth anymore. The flip side is, I think it's a tacit acknowledgement of the reality of modern Judaism, which is, if Mark Shapiro wakes up tomorrow and says, I don't want to shake the lulav on Sukkot, then Mark doesn't shake the lulav on Sukkot. And do we think that he's not earning his mitzvah points to go on to the next level? I don't think we think of it in binary terms like that, right? Like Judaism is not Pac-Man or Donkey Kong. You don't level up after you beat the level, right? Like you don't get all the points and munch all the dots and then go to the next thing. So when Mark decides whether he does a mitzvah or whether Elisheva decides whether she does a mitzvah, does it really matter? And I think that that's why when I write Tshuvot, or when I read Tshuvot, I'm thinking of the philosophy and the theology underpinning them. You thought that we were just going to talk about this weird phrase, positive time-bound commandments. It's one of the most important phrases in all of conservative Judaism, right? And clearly, by my incoherent rambling, you see why. Okay, Elisheva, go ahead.
I now have about 16 things, but I'll edit them out. With regard to time-bound positive mitzvot, women are not obligated, they're patur, they're exempt. Why are they exempt? Because they have an overriding mitzvah, usually the care of children, which means that you have no problem not going to minyan because you are patur, because you have an overriding commitment to your children.
Time out.
Said,
wait, time out. You said they're not exempt, they're patur.
I said they're not obligated. They are exempt patur.
They're exempt. Okay, you were correcting a thing. I said. Thank you.
They have an overriding mitzvah.
Yeah.
But the point I always love to make when this topic comes up is that women specifically are obligated to the most positive, most time-bound positive mitzvah, the lighting of Shabbat candles.
Right. We've mentioned that before.
How much more time-bound can you get?
Right. I know. It's a logical inconsistency in Judaism that I do not understand. I'll add
one other thing that I would add with regard to Joel Roth and his machinations about rabbinical students is that he is also the author of the Roth Minyan, in which women could be counted in the minyan if they stated upon questioning at the door that they obligated themselves to all of the mitzvot. And the problem I always had with that is that you're also not allowed to shame people.
Yeah.
And what does that do to the woman who says, no, sorry, I don't?
Yeah, I'll tell you real quick.
Hopefully the Roth Minyan doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, it's good knowledge. When I visited JTS in 1999, when I was living in New York City, because I wanted to be a rabbi and I wanted to maybe look at JTS. I looked at JTS, Ziegler, and Hebrew Union College. By the way, Eli Sheva, I had repressed this memory until this very moment. I have completely,
No, it's
good. I had completely forgotten that this happened. I spent Shabbat at JTS on the Upper West Side or in Washington Heights, depending on who you ask. And I came downstairs, I was staying with a friend, and I came downstairs for morning minyan. It was Parshat Breshit that week. And I went downstairs and somebody greeted me at the door and said, which minyan are you going to? I said, there's two minyans. And they said, oh yeah, there's the Egal minyan and there's the non-Egal minyan. I said, there's a what? They said, there's a non-Egal minyan down the hall and around the corridor. And I said, what's the non-Egal minyan? He said, oh, well, men and women sit together, but the women don't count for minyan. And I was like, right, Paula's response is my response, which was, are you effing kidding me that in 1999, the Jewish Theological Seminary of North America has a non-egalitarian minyan? And the response was, yes, well, the conservative movement is a big tent. And so, of course, we have the allowance for a non-egalitarian community, because the reality was there were a lot of non-egalitarian synagogues in the conservative movement still into 1999 and well into the mid 2000s. I don't think there are too many left. If they are, there's a few probably left in Canada, but there aren't too many in the conservative movement in North America. I, however, was appalled personally. This is no reflection on how you take things. I was appalled that the seminary was still allowing that, right? Had I been the chancellor of the seminary, I would have walked in one morning and said, right, you guys are done now. We're not doing this anymore, right? We're not going to have women rabbis get ordained who have to be told, you don't count in this minyan. That blew my freaking mind. And by the way, that and about 7 other things that happened to JTS over that, no joke, 36 hours absolutely convinced me not to go there, right? And if any of you ever want to share the story with Rabbi Adelson, he'll probably do his standard Rabbi Adelson thing, which is he'll just put his head down and go, oh, I know, yeah. And then he'll just move on.
If there were 4 votes for it in the Committee on Law and Standing, it was there.
Yeah, they changed that.
I went
minority views don't work anymore in the law committee.
I went to a synagogue for minyan for a week that I was in New York, in Flatbush of all places. It was conservative, which is why I chose to go there, but you really couldn't tell. I sat with everybody else, but one day there were 9 men and me, and they went out on the streets to find a 10th man. And the guy in front of me turned around and said, you know, we really should count you. And I said, fine by me. It's
Right.
your rules. You're the one who said it. You want to count me? By all means. They didn't. They dragged some poor guy in from the street and he counted. The other piece, of course, the other half of the Joel Roth minion is that they didn't ask the men whether they observed all the mitzvot.
That's right.
You could be a total scofflaw and you still
Right.
counted the minion.
Right. No, it's well said. All right. Rav Judy and
I
then
had
Marian.
fun there. At the end of the week, they said, so have you moved here? Are we going to see you every day? I said, relax. I'm only on vacation, leaving after tomorrow. And they all breathed a sigh of relief.
Rav Judy, did you want to talk?
Yeah, well, I'm remembering the two minions, and honestly, we can all be very proud of ourselves, but it's a living religion, and it changes and it evolves, and sometimes it goes backwards, in my point of view, and sometimes it goes forward. But I'm just curious. Amy was ordained in '97. So and I think it took her with the Mechanah year, I think it took her
Probably 6.
6. So she would have had to sign that paper.
Yep.
It was ordained, yeah.
For
So,
sure.
but
I have friends who signed
the
it.
opinions, and I think, you know, things change, things evolve. And
I'll say
for them.
anecdotally, the Ziegler School is struggling right now. It's the graduating class is only 4. When I went to Ziegler in 2001 to 2006, my graduating class was the largest of all time. It was 21. And the graduating class at JTS that year, I think was either like 23 or 25. And JTS got the message, which was because we didn't have a non-egalitarian minion and we didn't sign a paper at Ziegler, and roughly 50 to 60% of every incoming class at Ziegler was women, and roughly at JTS, 75% of every incoming rabbinical school class was men, right? The conservative movement voted with their feet, to be very honest, and the chancellor and the Jewish Theological Seminary looked around at a bunch of old, crusty white men, no offense to you fellow old, crusty white men, and said, we are screwing up the movement, right? Or more importantly, we're losing valuable cash dollars that are going to the Ziegler School over in Los Angeles. We need to make some changes or we're going to lose. And they did, right? By the time I finished, by 2009, 2012, JTS was seen as a much more inclusive place. And was doing better with regards to women and equality. But until 2015, JTS was kind of seen as a less good option if you were female. And that's really powerful. That's a really powerful kind of thing. All right. Sorry. Marian. Finish, Judy. I'm sorry.
One more thing. And that is that in Amy's class, and it's a good thing, I don't remember her name, I can see her face. She was called into the dean's office or the chancellor, whoever, and she was made to swear up and down that she wasn't gay.
Yep.
Or they weren't going to ordain her the next week.
Yep.
And she swore up and down and she was ordained. And then within the next few weeks, she came out.
Yeah, I know that, Rabbi. I think her name is Ayelet Cohen, and I think she wound up because she told me that story. B'Shem Omra. She told me that story from her own mouth, and she went to go work at the LGBT synagogue in New York City right afterwards, which was, and I think she was interning there at the time. But it was like, it was rough. It was rough sailing. By the way. You know, that's why I've been a passionate advocate my whole rabbinic career for my female colleagues, because they needed it, which also is absurd, you know, and that was always, it's still a fight. That fight is becoming less. We have other fights in the movement now, which, because I'm an idiot, I dive headfirst into. All right, Marian, go ahead.
Okay, first of all, I grew up in Inwood, which is just north of Washington Heights. so I know just where you're talking about. Okay. Anyway, you know Inwood, yes?
I don't know from New York at all. I lived in Brooklyn for a year. All I know is 3080 Broadway. Every conservative rabbi is forced to know the address of JTS. By the way, I don't think anybody at JTS knows the address of the American Jewish University, which, if you're wondering, is 15700 Mulholland Drive, or at least it is for the next couple months because they sold their campus. And my rabbinical school will probably be moving into the basement of an apartment in Pico Robertson in a couple weeks, but that's neither here nor there.
Anyway, I wanted to point out that when the Talmud and so forth were written, women were confined to the house pretty much. They had a lot more work to do than they do today. And today, women certainly do a lot more outside the house than they ever would have dreamed of at that time.
Yes.
So it's that makes a big difference. I wanted to tell you an anecdote. We made Aliyah in 1978, and we went back to visit our old congregation, which had not been egalitarian when we left. And we went back sometime in the 80s, I guess it must have been. And my husband was very pro women participation. He used to say, if I don't do everything and a woman knows much more than I do, why shouldn't she be able to do it? And right. Anyway, we went back and he used to participate in the minyan because he was a good guy and he wanted to make sure they had a minyan. Anyway, he went to a minyan and they were a bunch of women gathered in the office and a couple of men. And he figured to himself, oh, there's probably a sisterhood meeting or something like that. And he said he thought to himself when he realized what it was going to be, he said he absolutely shocked himself because he thought to himself, when I count 10 men, then I'll count the women. And he was absolutely shocked that he even thought something like that.
Nice.
Anyway.
Well done. We're gonna keep moving. We've done a really good job, but we actually technically pretty much left off here yesterday or last week. So we're gonna try and cover some ground. I'm gonna let you know, because remember, I mentioned this a couple weeks ago. Beth Shalom is going to be using because I think we can get there, getting to the end of this section as our siyum for Tani Bechorot. What I decided to do after I took a look at it last week, in order to get the pacing right so that we do it, is for the next couple weeks, sorry, not this week, but I have it on my calendar, I think the 2 weeks before Pesach, we're actually gonna go a half an hour longer, in which I will keep the Zoom stream open and none of you will get to talk, and I will just go really, really fast through the daf. And the goal will be, and then the next week, we'll actually probably go backwards to where we left off as a class. And the goal of this will be so that we can actually say we finished the entire Talmud in time, because I can mumble a bunch of Aramaic really, really fast if I need to, and that will absolve us of the obligation. Somebody at least learned it. Now, if you want to stay on and watch me mumble for a half an hour, sehr gesund hates, go and be well and be healthy. But if you're like, I don't need to sit here while Rabbi Goodman mumbles a thing that we're eventually going to get to 6 to 12 weeks from now, then feel free to just log off and do the laundry. Or if you're ELNE, you can do the laundry and keep my mumbling in your ear. So I can be the world's worst podcast. Okay, we're going to keep going. There's nothing interesting in line 8 because it just connects us to line 9, but I will say it anyways. And Eli Sheva, I'm going to make you read it again since it's not a whole lot of English. Elalav ish bebeito vefilu shelo bizman beitin la olam bizman beitin.
Rather, it is not the case that this phrase means every man in his house, and even at a time when the court is not in session. This presents a difficulty for the opinion of Rav Huna. The Gemara rejects this interpretation. Actually, it means that every man may sound the shofar in his house, but only at a time when the court is in session.
Right. So if we read the line above without the assumption of the concept of when the Beit Din is in session, we could assume that if the Beit Din doesn't meet, you could blow shofar on Shabbat, no matter what, as a yechid, as an individual. But the Gemara rejects that because it basically contradicts a principle that we've already laid down 3 lines above. Did the Talmud really need to do that? Probably not. But every once in a while, the Talmud in Aramaic is redundant for purposes of clarification. That's at least my read of what this is doing here. Onward, we're going to have Marion read. Meitiv Rav Sheshet. Shave hayovel Rosh Hashanah letkiya vela brachot. Eile sheba yovel tokin bein babeitin shekidshu bo et hachodesh ubein babeitin shelo kidshu bo et hachodesh. V'kol yechid ve'yechid chayav litkoa. Barosh Hashanah lo hayu tokin eile bebeit din shekidshu bo et hachodesh. Ve'en kol yechid ve'yechid chayav litkoa. Go ahead, Marion. Make sure, there you
Yeah, okay. Rav Sheshet raised an objection from another baraita. Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year is the same as Rosh Hashanah with regard to both the shofar sounding and the additional blessings recited in the Amidah prayer. However, the difference is that on Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, they sound the shofar both in the court where they sanctified the months and in a court where they did not sanctify the months. And each and every individual is obligated to sound the shofar. Conversely, on Rosh Hashanah, they sound the shofar only in the court. I can't see the next slide. Thank you. They sound the shofar only in the court where they sanctified the months, and each and every individual is not obligated to sound it.
So we have a short matter of jurisprudence as to the difference between the manner in which the Beit Din adjudicates the blowing of shofar in Beit Din on Yovel years versus how they do it on Rosh Hashanah. I don't really know that there's anything fascinating about this. I find it interesting that Steinsaltz does nothing with this line. He basically just says it and moves along. And also in my more elucidated commentary that I have in Hebrew. Okay, onward, or as we say in Yiddish, weiter. Some of you really enjoy that. I'm gonna have Maddie read because Maddie is our guest today and we have not seen Maddie in a really long time. So Maddie, welcome back. Thanks for joining us. Is it okay? Are you up for reading? Are you in a public place and we'll sound?
I don't know if you can hear me because it's a little loud.
We can hear you and I want to hear you if that's okay with you.
Oh, great.
Cool.
Great.
All right, I'm gonna read the Aramaic and you'll read the Hebrew. My ein kol yechid v'yechid chayvin litkoa. Ilema de yovel tokin yechidin. Uberosh Hashanah ein tokin yechidin. Vaha ki ata Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef Amar ki have Messiah shlicha de tzibora tikiyata beyavne lo shama inish kal unya mikal tokia de yechideya.
The Gemara asks, what is the meaning of the clause, each and every individual is not obligated to sound it? If we say that on Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, individuals sound the shofar, whereas on Rosh Hashanah, individuals do not sound it at all, this is difficult. But when Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia, he said, when the prayer leader completed the sounding of the shofar in Yavne, nobody could hear the sound of his own voice in his ears due to the noise of the sounding of individuals. This indicates that individuals would sound the shofar even on Rosh Hashanah.
So this brings back a thing we talked about, I think, last week and the week before, for those of you who may not have been here, which is there is this quote from Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef that we learned already, which I had forgotten briefly, which is that there was a principle that was laid down halachically in Gemara that there was a yechid responsibility not only for hearing shofar, but for blowing shofar. And therefore, there is the possibility, and I think this is wild because we don't do this anymore. There is the possibility that the mitzvah of shofar was almost identical to the mitzvah of lulav, right? That lulav and etrog is a thing where watching Rabbi Adelson do it does not fulfill your obligation, right? However, on the flip side, watching Rabbi Adelson blow the shofar does fulfill your obligation. But it seems very, very clear that according to this statement of Rav Yitzhak Bar Yosef, based on a thing that he witnessed when coming from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he saw that when the Shaliach Tzibur blew shofar, they would conclude by having everybody else blow shofar, right? So be like, just like we do with lulav, right? The leader shakes the lulav and then everyone else would conclude by them shaking the lulav, right? That's a really interesting statement. I'll just add one more thing, which is the framing of saying Rav Yitzhak Bar Yosef came from Israel to Babylonia. The Babylonians, remember, the Babylonian Jewish community was established at the time of the exile of the first destruction of the temple. And the distance between the Tigris and the Euphrates community and Palestine was very, very far, right? You would have to go on a camel train from one to the other, and it would have been a long distance and very difficult. There was not a lot of frequent communication between these two communities. And so when a rabbi, and specifically if there was communication between these two communities, it was probably Chaim Yankel selling spices to Plonit Bat Shmonit, right? Like it was business, right? Like they probably weren't sending rabbinic things. I can speak for this authoritatively, professionally, which is when we moved here from Denver, Colorado, we occasionally got questions from my local rabbinic colleagues asking the questions, what do you do about this in Pittsburgh, right? I'll give you a great example. We don't dunk Beit Din in Denver exactly the same way we dunk Beit Din for mikvah here in Pittsburgh. The rabbis here in Pittsburgh that I've done Beit Din for, by the way, I did one last week, I'm doing one this week with Rav Judy. The way we would do Beit Din is we dunk 3 times. The first time you dunk, you say Al HaTvilah. Second dunk, you say Shehechianu. Third dunk, you come up and you say Shema. In Pittsburgh, they dunk once, they do Al HaTvilah, they dunk 2 more times and do Shehechianu, and then they're done. There is no Shema Yisrael here in Pittsburgh. It's just minhag, they're different customs, but we don't even talk enough to know how things are done. So Rabbi Yitzhak bringing a halacha from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, it feels very real to me, except he had to go on a camel train that probably took 8 weeks. I can get on a plane and be in Pittsburgh in 5 hours. So modern technology. Someday rabbis will have this reflection and be like, I don't know what they're talking about. I just use the teleporter and I beam myself to Paris and I tell the rabbis what's what, so it's very interesting. So let's keep going and figure out how we're supposed to blow shofar properly. Spoiler alert, you all know that in every congregation in the world, they don't have one guy blow or one gal blow shofar and then have everybody else blow, individually. Okay, we're on 11. So let's see, who should read there? One guy, one gal, or one individual, I should say. Apology for gendering. I have made mistakes and I'm working on it. And for those of you who know, my daughter came out as non-binary a couple months ago. So I'm still like, my wife and I are playing the they them game on a nearly nightly basis. It is work, but we're committed to the work. All right. Let's see. I don't think Rav Judy has read yet. Rav Judy, will you mind reading the English of 11? Elalav.
I wouldn't mind, but I talk so much.
That's
Maybe
fine.
someone else.
No, we're good. You're good. Reading is reading. It's just all the voices. And I know I can't ask Noreen because Noreen is on a bus somewhere. Elalav, the ilu bayovel, tokin bein bisman beit din, bein shelo bisman beit din. Uba Rosh Hashanah bisman beit din, ein shelo bisman beit din la Katani mihat, bayovel bein bisman beitin, bein shelo bisman beitin.
Rather, it is not the case that whereas on Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, they sound the shofar both when the court is in session and when the court is not in session. On Rosh Hashanah, when the court was in session, yes, they would indeed sound it. But at a time when the court was not in session, no, they would not sound the shofar. In any event, the Braita is teaching that on Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, they would sound the shofar both when the court was in session and when the court was not in session. This presents a difficulty for the opinion of Rav Huna.
Great. So if it's a pretty complicated little sticky piece of logic, but basically we've got two statements in the Gemara that seemingly contradict one another regarding the procedure of whether you needed a Beit Din to physically be in session during the blowing of shofar, and whether that applied in both the case of Jubilee and on Rosh Hashanah. And it seems that you couldn't blow shofar if the court was not in session on Rosh Hashanah, but you could do it on the Jubilee year, which that whole statement is not exactly what Rav Huna said. All right. Renee, you're going to pick up number 12, if it's okay by you. La'olam bisman beitin, v'hachi katani, v'yovil bisman beitin, tokin bein bifnei beitin, bein shelo bifnei beitin. Barosh Hashanah, tokin bisman beitin, u bifnei beitin. Itamar nami. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Gamada. Amar Rav Yossi bein Shaul Amar Rabbi. Ein tokin ele kol zman shebeit din yoshvin.
The Gemara rejects this argument. No, actually, they should sound the shofar only when the court was in session. And this is what the Baraita is teaching. On Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, when the court was in session, they sound the shofar, both in the presence of the court and not in the presence of the court. However, on Rosh Hashanah, they sound it only when the court was in session, and even then, only in the presence of the court. It was also stated that Rabbi Chaya bar Gamda said that Rabbi Yossi ben Shaul said that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said they sound the shofar only throughout the period when the court is sitting in session and only in its presence.
Okay, so well done. They're trying to go through the logical argument of whether it's permitted to do this if they're not actually live, but if they're kind of Memorex, right? If not really Memorex, like recording, but this central principle that they're wrestling with is twofold. One, whether the rules really differ between Rosh Hashanah and the Jubilee or the Yovel, and if they differ, which one is more important? And if there is a difference, is the difference based on whether you do it before the Beit Din or not, and where the permissibility is if you're blowing shofar when you're not before the presence of the Beit Din, or whether the argument is actually about being at the time of. So my interpretation of this is very simply that being in the presence of the Beit Din, I think most people will agree, being in the presence of the Beit Din is a slightly higher standard, a slightly more strict ruling. But the question is, could we abide by a slightly less strict ruling in which it's just about whether you're doing at the time or not? The rabbis throw out that idea in this paragraph and say, the idea that on Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, you could blow shofar when the Beit Din on Shabbat, when the Beit Din is not in session, is not okay by us, right? Like, which sort of makes sense, right? Like it's the idea of like, could you count for, it's very similar to the idea, could you count for a minyan at a time before or after the minyan has actually occurred, right? So like, let's say Beth Shalom has services at 9:30 on a Saturday morning, and you say, I'll be there at 10:30, and you get to Kaddish and there's 9 people in the room, and they go, oh, don't worry, we're going to hold by this principle of lo bizman. Rabbi Goodman will be here at 10:30, and therefore we can reasonably assume that we effectively have a minyan now, right? You may say that sounds kind of absurd, right? Paula just shook her head and said, you can't do that, right? That's the principle that they were trying to apply in the previous paragraph, which is you can blow shofar even when the Beit Din is not session on Shabbat, because there's a reasonable presumption that the law allows for that. And the status of Yovel is not as high as the status of Rosh Hashanah, which, by the way, is pretty weird because Yovel only appears every 50 years. Rosh Hashanah happens every year. Nonetheless, to your point, Paula, the rabbis also shook their head and in the Zoom call said, they can't do that. And the answer is, you can't do that, right? They reject that with this paragraph. The final line, and this is the last important thing I'll say, is the final line in the Aramaic is Ein tokin ele kol zman she beit din yoshvin. But the most important thing of this half a page of Talmudic argument is the idea has been rejected that the principle of the Beit Din sitting is about a Beit Din existing in your town. It's about actually sitting before the Beit Din, and they have beaten this idea into us over and over again. And we know that this is the most authoritative take because of who it's quoted in the name of. Chia bar Gamda, you don't know who he is. Yossi bar Shaul, we don't know who he is. Rabbi is the guy that they mentioned last, or Rabbi as they say in Hebrew. That's Yehuda Hanassi, right? Yehuda Hanassi is the editor, compiler, and author of the Mishnah. You do not get a more authoritative voice in Talmud than him. It's like a full-on mic drop to say, this is the guy who said this thing, right? But what we've done here is read logic into what that means here and decide that the Beit Din actually has to be physically sitting. And it can't just be that, and you have to be standing before them. And it can't just be that you are sitting before that the Beit Din is across the street in the old executive office building. All right, go ahead, Renee.
Well, did you move it back a minute?
Sorry.
Okay, it says they sound only throughout the period. Are they talking about Rosh Hashanah? When they say, throughout, what are they talking about?
Where's the word throughout here? Oh, at the end. They sound the shofar only throughout
only
the period.
Throughout.
Ein tokin ela. So the Hebrew of that is kol zman she beit din yoshvin, which means when the Beit Din sits down, you may blow shofar. When the Beit Din gets up and goes to lunch, you may not blow shofar.
Okay, it has nothing to do with whether it's Rosh Hashanah on the Jubilee year, or that's not what they're talking about.
No, but the line that they're applying is applied both to Jubilee and to Rosh Hashanah.
And to Rosh Hashanah.
Right.
Okay.
You need a Beit Din for both. There may be a slight variation as to how the laws are done, but the way that they have finished out this long argument is on Rosh Hashanah, you need to be standing in front of the Beit Din in order to do it. So clearly, obviously, it has to be at the time the Beit Din is sitting. On Yovel, an individual can blow on the other side of town, but they have to, get a telegraph message that says the Beit Din is in session right now, right? Like, hear ye, the Beit Din is sitting. Everybody across Squirrel Hill can blow their shofar now, right? It is as if Beth Shalom said, you can blow shofar from 9:30 to 1 p.m. on your own at home during COVID, even if you're not in synagogue. But after 1 o'clock, you're no longer permitted to blow shofar because we are not having services anymore. That's an analogy. It's not a parallel. Go ahead, Elisha.
Okay.
I hate to throw a wrench in the works, but
Please throw wrenches.
Isn't there a problem with the Beit Din sitting, i.e. being in session during Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, both of which are days that have work prohibitions?
Nope. I mean, it's the same, and I make this joke all the time, but it's the same idea that Rabbi Goodman doesn't work on Shabbat. Rabbi Goodman works extra hard on Shabbat. Rabbi Goodman was working from the beginning of Shabbat to the end of Shabbat.
Right, but you're not doing the 39 prohibited melachot.
Basically, but remember, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and it came up in the Gemara. They used the question of what happens with the Kohanim in the temple with the baking of the showbread on Shabbat and on holidays? And the answer is you bake the showbread on Shabbat and holidays. The rules of the temple superseded all the rules because it's backwards, right? The 39 melachot of Shabbat were established for things you cannot do in building the Mishkan. You're not building the Mishkan when you're baking the loaves. You're doing the essential work that the Mishkan existed to do.
On the other hand, you're using fire, but
you're allowed to
Din,
for that purpose. You're
the
supposed to.
Din is not a priest in the temple, and if they're in session, then they're doing their regular weekday job.
Right, but
or
well
by
said.
in session, do they mean during this 3 months we're in session, not necessarily that they're actively hearing a case?
I mean, we're interpreting it as they're sitting, right? The court came in at 9 a.m. and leaves at 3 p.m., right? Because during
Okay, so they're working.
yeah, they're there, and that's what we've been establishing, which is because the argument has been you have to go before them, you have to be in front of them. By the way, we very, very, very much know that the laws of baking, cooking, and slaughtering did not apply on Shabbat in the temple, and all you need to know about that is the word musaf, right? The musaf offering was an additional offering that was specifically only on holidays and Shabbat,
holidays,
right? And it's not like the musaf offering, I believe, has been thrown to me as an offering of cakes of fine flour, but that's actually technically the mincha is always cakes of fine flour. I think if I'm not mistaken, that live animals were also brought to the temple on Shabbat to be slaughtered and to be roasted, right? And the entire bleeding of it was, and that blows our minds, right? You're like, you can't do that on Shabbat. And the answer is we all have it backwards, right? The rules of the temple supersede the rules of Shabbat, period, point blank, right? You can't slaughter an animal and bait and grill it for a barbecue on Shabbat because you want to. But if you're a priest in the temple, that's your job. Like that, you have to do that. So it's really weird. It strikes us that the rules are different in the temple and outside the temple. But yes, that's exactly the point. The rules are different.
Except the Beit Din is not in the temple.
What's that?
The Beit Din is not in the temple.
So that's the other thing I was going to say is that like the fact that the Beit Din seems to be doing things that feel like work on Shabbat is based on a whole challenging post-destruction principle where the rabbis are trying to make it up as they go along, right? They're trying to change a tire on a moving car, which is they are trying to figure out what does Judaism look like without the temple? And I think to your point, Elisheva, really well said, subtly put, the Beit Din is throwing down authoritative legal principles that are kind of basically saying we are as powerful as the temple itself, which feels a little silly, except 2,000 years later, we don't have a temple anymore. And the only place you can pray and experience divine connection and community is through going to synagogue. We have replaced the temple completely. The rabbis were just kind of trying to do it more authoritatively and on the fly. Let's do one more line, just so I feel vindicated that we have a line that we haven't properly explained. I'm going to try and remember this. 30A, line 13. I will put this class. I will make sure I put a mark in my book so that we don't waste any time next week. We don't waste any time in this class. It's all Halaga study. I want to kind of finish with a blessing though before we do this last line, which is what we've wrestled with the last 2 weeks is the question of the difference between being present for a thing and actually seeing it versus knowing that it's going on but not actually being there for it. This is, I think, really analogous for us to the difference between experiencing things on Zoom and experiencing things in person, right? To be present for the things that we can be present for. We are coming slowly, kanaina hora poo poo poo, as we said in the car on the way to school this morning, out of COVID. But some people are developing habits around Zoom and using Zoom as a thing where it supersedes the real experience or being there in person. I'm not telling you that Zoom is bad. I love Zoom. I think it's great, but I think we should all take a moment to think of the difference between being bizman u lifnei, right? The difference between doing something at the time that it's going on, doing your dishes while you listen to this this class, versus being present in person for it and for all other manner of things, right? Being actually in the place. We're gonna do 13, and then we're gonna call it a day.
On the other hand, we couldn't be here at all
No
if
doubt.
it weren't for Zoom.
I am never going to an in-person only model because the people of Carmiel would not.
And Beersheba.
And Beersheba. Sorry.
And Beersheba, yes.
Right. Your soccer team's better. I don't even know why I pick on the people or call out.
What about the Wednesday class? Are they?
We'll continue hybrid forever.
Really?
And as far as I know, main sanctuary services are going to be hybrid forever. Just so you know.
Oh, interesting. And what about masks? Have they changed? Because the JCC, as of tomorrow,
the COVID committee meets on Mondays, so I will not speak for the COVID committee. I do what they tell me, right? Rabbi Goodman is the mushroom of Congregation Beth Shalom. They just keep me in the dark and shovel SHIT on top of me. All right, we're gonna do 13. Oh. You can tell my bosses that. No, I love working there. It's great. No, it's recording. No, but I really do carry out the will of the people who want me to carry out their will. I do not necessarily say, well, we should do this. We should do it this way. I don't. All right, 13, and then we'll call it a day. And maybe eventually Maddie will stop laughing at me. And Paul is going to read this in English because Paul is already unmuted. By Rabbi Zera, Nin aru lamod velo amdu mahu beitin yoshvin be'enan v'ha'ika o dilma zman beitin be'enan veleka teku.
Rabbi Zera raised a dilemma. If the members of the court stirred themselves to rise at the end of the session, but there was some delay and they did not actually rise, what is the halacha? Do we require that the court be seated? And that is the case here, as the judges are still sitting? Or perhaps we require that the shofar must be sounded when the court is in session, and that is not the case, as they have stirred to rise. No relevant sources were found in this regard, and therefore the Gemara states that the question shall stand unresolved.
Okay, so
this is unreal.
The final quote is basically a how many angels dance on the head of a pin kind of Talmudic moment, which is, but it's really important. And if you're a sports fan, it matters, right? Did the ball go over the line? Because there's a fraction of a millimeter that didn't cross the line. Is it a goal or is it not a goal? I'm always going to use soccer as my analogy, right? So you could say that's absurd. Like, why are we dealing in angels dancing on the head of pin scenarios? And the answer is, well, if you bet $1 million on the game, it matters, right? Like, these things matter to some degree. So the question is, you burst into the Beit Din at the absolute last moment to blow your shofar and fulfill your obligation. And they, by the way, if you're wondering, and this is the way we learned it when I was in yeshiva, the question is, the Beit Din is literally sitting and they get to this position. They stir to leave, right? They're half up and they're half down. They're not out of their chairs. They haven't stood to leave, but they're not really there. Does it count? Are they Beit Din Yoshvin if they're halfway out of their chairs? That is literally how my Rebbeim in rabbinical school explained this principle to me, which I think is fascinating, right? They are literally like playing with the idea of, are you sitting? Are you standing? I don't know, right? It's very Jewish. This is maybe the most Jewish moment we've had in this class in a very long time. And the answer that they come to is even more Jewish, which is they end with a teku. A teku is, you all in Israel know this because, again, and it's mostly intentional that I talk about soccer, a teku in a sports context in modern Israel is a tie. By the way, where does the term teku come from in sports in Israel? This page of Talmud, or all the other pages of Talmud with the concept of teku. Eliezer ben Yehuda knew enough Talmud to know that the principle of the idea of a tie was a Talmudic idea. He imported it into modern Hebrew from the Talmud. This is exactly where it comes from. A teku is an unresolved problem in the Gemara that is left unresolved. The Gemara generally argues without resolving things. Occasionally, it will be authoritative by laying down a verse, a principle, a Mishnah, or a Baraita that seemingly defeats the other ones. But occasionally, you'll get a Talmudic argument which ends without satisfaction. It ends in kind of a nebulous place. And sometimes they will literally say, we don't know how to rule in this case. And they say teku. I'll say the final thing and then the class is done. A teku, according to some commentators, I believe within the Talmud, and then it's been taken on faith that this is literally what it means, is believed to be an acronym. Some people think this. I don't think so. I think teku really means tie, but I think they added an acronym to it because it was cool. And the phrase teku is a acronym, is a Rosh Tevot for Tishbi Yishava Kushiot Ubayot, which translates as Eliyahu Hanavi, right? The guy who comes at the end of Havdalah and is a messianic individual or a harbinger of the Messiah, because he is one of the very few characters in all of the Tanakh who does not die. God pulls Eliyahu Hanavi up to heaven without experiencing death. And that makes them a permanent intercessor between the divine world and the corporeal world. At the end of days, Eliyahu Hanavi will answer all the questions. The funny thing about that is also in yeshiva, in the Orthodox world, there's this joke that goes around that when the Messiah comes, he'll be standing there, he or she will be standing there, and everyone, or they, he or she or they will be standing there, and the Messiah will be, I'm the Messiah, and a couple people will say, yay, and then to the Messiah's right, there will be a very long line of Gemara scholars standing next to the harbinger of the Messiah, Eliyahu Hanavi, and they will all stand there and say, all right, we've got this teku on page 30a, and I need to know, is it this or is it this? Which one is it? All right, that's our class for today. I hope you all had a really good time. We are going to stop the